Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I'm sorry for not posting lately. I had technical difficulties with my microphone, and then I was also competing at regionals, practicing for state, taking the ACT, and applying for colleges, so it was just a really full schedule. And I also went to a campus visit, so I apologize for the late video, and I'll try to post weekly again, but I may be busy during the second to third week of April since I'll be interning and also competing at state. So in today's video, we'll be looking over the main definition of advocacy, along with the one that I prefer. If you haven't watched all the videos about this topic, then I recommend you do so. So let's go ahead and get into it. So I know there are a lot of definitions of advocacy, and you might be pondering whether you should change your own definition or you're just starting out and wondering what definition you use. And perhaps you're also looking for answers to against like a fact-based advocacy. So in my opinion, advocacy journalism is a genre of journalism that adopts a non-objective transpoint or viewpoint, usually from some like social or political purpose. And I'm pretty sure that is defined by, that's defined by Merriam-Webster. It's either Merriam-Webster or it is by Wikipedia. Let's find out. So, advocacy journalism, fact-based. Okay, so here it is by Wikipedia. So advocacy journalism is a genre of journalism that adopts a non-objective viewpoint, usually for some social or political purpose, and some advocacy journalism reject the traditional ideal of objectivity is possible or practical, and in part is due to the perceived influence of corporate sponsors and advertising. So this is probably the main definition that would be for the fact-based journalism. So some feel that the public interest is better served by a diversity of media outlets with a variety of transparent points of view, or that advocacy journalism serves a similar role to muckrakers or whistleblowers. Now, this may seem unfair, in my opinion, as a negative, as you're mainly debating a fact versus opinion debate at this point. So I choose to narrow down the debate by differentiating between the types of journalism. To do this, I'm no longer making the debate based on fact versus opinion, but rather on bias versus non-bias. So instead of defining like advocacy as a singular word, we're defining advocacy as a compound word. So it would be advocative journalism instead of advocacy, because in the resolution, it's specifically talking about a free press. So by just defining what advocacy is, then we're defining a singular term. But instead, we're defining what advocative journalism, which is a compound term. And rather, we're talking about how they report on information and not on the information itself. Because we can obviously see that objectivity, of course, can report on information where the information is actually not true. But rather we are trying to find a method journalism that reports on information, so it's a bias versus no bias debate. Because the information, so if we have an example of climate change, what happens is an objective or advocative journalism, they get the scientist or whoever made the information, that's what they use as their information, and how they report on it is whether it's advocative or objective. So we're not debating on the information itself, but rather how they report on that information. So when trying to find out what the debate is about, I usually identify the main differences between the clashing terms, which in this case is advocacy and objectivity. Now, if you refer to past videos, we can see that objectivity, forgive me for that spelling, okay. So we can see that objectivity is a lack of favoritism or like a freedom for bias and such. So this would be the best for the clashing between the resolution, which is what you as the negative are trying to prove. You'd say for like the resolution to actually clash, where there'd be a difference between objectivity and advocacy, then we can see it's a bias versus non-bias side, or like expressing your own perception, emotions, or imagination, and so forth. So that's what we're trying to limit the debate to be, because we can see that this is the only way to have clash in the resolution. You can also bring out root terms and whatnot, but then you also have to be mindful that you're defining a singular term rather than the compound term. So if you're going to look up objectivity or objective journalism, something might come up differently. Or you could define objectivity differently, because objectivity you could also define as a prioritization would be the American Press Institute, in which they are prioritizing objectivity, in which it's fact-based or testing information, but they'd still be having biases or standards. But in my opinion, I would still, like for resolution clashes, should be without bias, but that's dependent on how you debate. And as the affirmative, I would try to limit it down to facts versus non-facts, because we can obviously see that due to the term prioritize, that there's not really anything to debate against in the resolution if it's biased versus non-biased, because it doesn't make sense to prioritize one over the other if we're going to still have the other. So there's like literally no point in debating if we do that. So as affirmative, you want to do it fact versus non-fact, and as a negative, you want to do bias versus non-bias. So like when it comes time for getting a card for the definition of advocacy for the negative, I'll just look up like advocacy, journalism, truth before emotion or something. So when it comes time for getting a card for advocacy, there are many alternatives and sources that agree with my point of view. But for right now, we'll just go ahead and settle for the click news. I've already clicked on it right here. So if we go into this article, straight off the bat, we can already see two things. So the first is that in the article's name, it says when it comes to advocacy journalism, the truth should come before emotion, and it's talking about truth should come before emotion. So it's essentially saying that advocacy journalism is fact-based. So we can already see that advocacy journalism is already talking about the truth. It's how we report on truth. But it's saying before emotion in this article, which could automatically be turned against you as the negative, but there's like other sources that agree with this, like scientific journalism, for instance. That would still be what I would classify as advocacy journalism. And then the second thing you can notice is that automatically, when we look in here, we can see that it has an introduction into advocacy journalists about how they take a different stance than other journalists. So it automatically perks your interest, and you can already see that the article automatically goes into the definition that we plan on using. Now, most affirmatives that I've used this definition against mostly just say it's essentially doing the half. So you really want to show the difference between advocating journalism and propaganda and whatnot. Now, of course, to cut this card, then we need to find the most useful information it contains by like paragraph, which we'll say it begins like right here at the beginning of the article, and then it ends somewhere around the third paragraph, because we can obviously see that the third paragraph talks about how advocated journalism is presented by verified facts and sources and whatnot. So that's enough to get our point across just by using this right here. So we just go ahead and copy that, and then we go to our Word document and we paste it. So if you watched the last video, you know the order of citations is like author's last name and last two digits of the year, full author's name, the date published, source, title, date, access, URL, qualifications, page numbers, and your signature to show that you were the one who cut the card. So looking at this evidence, we can already see all the things pretty much that we need. We can already see the author's names, which is Dana Gibbons, and then we can also see the date, and then if you click on the name, it should give you the qualifications. But we're not going to go into the exact cutting of the cards. So for right now, we're just going to go back to our original text, and we're going to cut the text. So just by looking at this, we can already see that essentially we do not need this center paragraph, because it's talking about the New York City Police Department staged a mass arrest and assault a group of peaceful protesters. So we already know we don't need that, because that's not really defining the term, but it could become useful later. So that would be just, we could either put those three dots in, or for the sake of paragraphs, we can like exclude that and just have that instead. But for sake of time, we're just going to include the three dots. So the main thing we want to provide is the distinguishment between other types of journalists, because we know that there's propaganda, which is what most affirmatives are going to go for. They're going to say that advocated journalism is essentially foreign propaganda, and that can lead to many assortment of things, such as discrimination and whatnot. But what you're trying to do is say that advocacy journalism is just pushing biases. So you say advocated journalists take a different stance than other journalists when it comes to journalism. And then what you're going to say is that they back up their arguments with evidence in addition to getting testimonies. And of course, you can cut this down. No, you can. Like, you can cut this down further if you ever need it. But for right now, we'll just keep at this. Let's see. And well, actually, we'll start from present. See if we can get that term. No, we cannot get the term by itself. Let's see if we can get without highlighting the whole thing. There we go. Okay, and they present an argument backed up by verified facts and sources. So that automatically limits the debate, saying that you aren't debating about the information, but rather how they report on the information, because obviously we're doing that debate, and you can refer to the climate change thing I presented earlier. And for the sake of time, we will not highlight the text that I just cut, but it's basically saying that advocacy journalists take a different stand than the other journalists. They back up their arguments with evidence on event in addition to getting testimonies, and they present an argument backed up by verified facts and sources. So that's enough to prove that advocacy journalism is based on facts, because we're not reporting on the information. Well, we're not talking about the information, we're talking about how they report on the information, because once again, this is the press. So to reiterate for this video, we are mainly focusing on how they report on information, not the information itself, because journalism, whether it's objective or advocative, cannot determine the information or what they get the information from. Now, objectivity would be the one that they say that they try to verify, have a method of proof essentially. But that would be for the last review of the affirmatives definitions. But once again, we're just limiting the debate of how they report on whether it's non-biased or biased, which essentially limits the affirmative ground a ton, because it shows how prioritization is not necessarily necessary by the route that most affirmatives take. So in conclusion, you just need to remember that you as the negative need to show the difference between advocating journalism and other forms, as the affirmative brings up, and things that deviate from propaganda, or they can alternatively say that you're essentially doing the half depending on your style going through definitions. The way to get against this is that they're defining a singular term of advocacy, so saying that advocacy is just biases. Rather, you are defining the full advocative journalism. You're defining a compound term rather than a singular term to show it's more specific to the resolution. So just try to narrow down the debate and be specific examples to convince your judge. Specific examples and statistics always convince your judge, but try not to overuse them too much. Just use them like once in your rebuttal speech. It might be something that's really impactful. And also show how we aren't debating on the information around, but rather have the way we report on the information. And additionally, you need to remember that the term prioritize in resolution also works inversely, meaning that you as the negative still have objectivity in the status quo. And then in a more of a conclusionary side, just remember that you as a negative, you're negating the whole resolution. So you don't have to defend a democracy, and you don't have to defend advocacy. You just have to show why we shouldn't prioritize objectivity. Now, that might entail defending a democracy, or that might entail defending advocacy, but you don't have to do it off the bat. So just remember your grounds and show the difference between the sides, and that draws us to the end of our video, of course. So please like, share, and subscribe, and comment below if you have a certain topic you'd like to be covered or anything. And our next video will be over light framework overview and value creation and refutations, as I got a request for that. And again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.